And to begin a very special event today, which celebrates the end of CoEDL, the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. And as the very first thing to do, I would like to welcome Cheyne Halloran, Ngunnawal Elder, who will be giving us the welcome to country. So Cheyne, many thanks for coming along today, and I'll hand over to you to do the welcome to country.
With permission from my elders, I say, Yuma, Yumolundi, Yangu Ngalawiri, Dunimanya, Ngunnawal Wari, Daura Wari. Hello and welcome. Today we're here in Ngunnawal country. My name is Cheyne Halloran. I'm a Ngunnawal man. I'm a descendant of the Namich and the Walluvalua people of the Ngunnawal tribe. I acknowledge my ancestors and elders who are traditional custodians of the region encompassing Canberra, the ACT and surrounds. I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. The Ngunnawal people pay our respects to our traditional neighbours, the Gurungara to the north, the Walluvalua to the south, the Wiradjuri to the west, the Yuin to the east, and the Ngarago to the southeast. We know that a welcome to country is an ancient Aboriginal protocol that ensures that once welcomed, your body and spirit are protected whilst on another's land. The Ngunnawal people welcome you and ask our ancestors to provide you a safe journey during your time on country. Yinjumara, Daura, Yinjumara, Gudua. As we show our respect to the land and the people around us, we know the same respect will be shown to us. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all elders, leaders, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, whose knowledge and experience hold so much value in guiding our modern society as we shape an inclusive future for all. As always in my welcomes, I'd like to speak and highlight a particular Ngunnawal word. Today I'd like to talk about the word Yinjumara. Yinjumara is a word commonly translated from Ngunnawal to English to mean respect, but more accurately it's defined as a lifestyle philosophy of respect and harmony, traditionally with the land and with the people around you, and with the environment. As a Ngunnawal man, I'm very fortunate to have elders who use their life experience and vision to encourage younger generations to use our strengths, our culture, and importantly, to understand our vulnerabilities so we can one day become effective leaders ourselves. The Ngunnawal is a community carrying ancient culture forward into the future. We do this by understanding where we've come from, where we are, and where we need to be. My elders talk about three phases of our culture. Phase one, the history of pre-colonisation, where there were thousands of years of cultural practice, medicine, trade, law and diplomacy. And phase two, invasion and assimilation, the destruction of culture and the linguicide, the lack of equality and of equity, where all of that conflict came with a bad mindset. We have to understand and acknowledge this past, and that often gets pushed aside before we can move on. Phase three, which makes me proud to be an Ngunnawal man, my elders see as the phase where we do acknowledge the past and then we work with each other to forge a future where we can all move forward together. So we can have a future where we can all rejoice. This is the Australia that we strive for. Yumulundi Galambanya, Gajali Yinjumara Winange, Nalaganawali. I say welcome as we respectfully come together to look, listen and learn for the well-being of all. Thank you.
Can I just thank you, Cheyne, for your lovely welcome, and as a small gift of thanks, present you this book called In a Time of Our Lives, whose authors are both here today. I'm just searching. Yes. Oh, okay. And Lizzie Ellis. And it struck me that in the time of our lives, we have gone through all those phases. So I'd like to thank you for bringing us into this third phase. Thank you. So we now pass to the next moment in our program, and we will have an opening address that's pre-recorded by Sharon Davis, who unfortunately cannot be here in person, but they've kindly agreed to pre-record it. And without further ado, I will pass over to the screen. So thank you, Sharon, in absentia, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
What now, you mob? I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm recording this video on today, the Ngunnawal people. I recognise and respect their laws and continuing connection to land, culture and community. I honour the resilience and wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and pay respect to elders past and present. This place always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am honoured to be presenting this keynote address for the End of Centre event for the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. My name is Sharon Davis. I am from both Bardi and Gidja peoples of the Kimberley, and I'm the Director of Education and Ethics at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Sorry I can't be with you in person today. Right about now, I'm sitting on Yulnyul and Bardi country in the Kimberley, probably fishing, or depending on the time of day that you're watching this, I'm either sipping a cuppa with my mum overlooking the ocean, or I'm blowing the froth off a coldie with my dad on the beach. Either way, I can certainly guarantee you that I am much warmer than you are right now. Jokes aside, I would have loved to have been there in person today delivering this keynote, but alas, somebody has to soak up the salt water and the sun, and I am certainly prepared to make that sacrifice. Today's event is a chance for everyone to reflect on the deadly work of CoEDL and its significant contributions to the language research space over the past several years. And although the centre is winding down, this is by no means the end of CoEDL's impact. In fact, as we begin the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, the work that CoEDL has inspired and supported is far from over. The activities and research generated by the centre throughout its duration will be foundational to the next decade of work on Indigenous languages, especially in terms of the important work that is being done in relation to language revitalisation. The Centre's success in supporting the work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics, and in turn the communities they work in partnership with, has generated significant impact. This success is reflected in a range of positive outcomes documented in the CoEDL 2021 annual report, including the fact that the proportion of CoEDL publications with an Indigenous author or co-author is now close to 10%. Additionally, initiatives such as Jackie Troy and Leslie Wood's study group, Decolonising Linguistics, Spinning a Better Yarn, is an invaluable way in which the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander linguists and researchers can be promoted and supported. Driven by an agenda of self-determination, the Spinning a Better Yarn group is helping to generate new ethical models for language research, framed by a human rights agenda. And so, a little beginning bit about my love of education and Aboriginal English. I have over a decade worth of experience in Aboriginal education. I am primary school teacher trained, and I have a Master's in Applied Linguistics from the University of Oxford in the UK, which looked at attitudes and understandings of Aboriginal English in Australian student teachers. I moved to Canberra about 2 years ago now from Perth, where I led Aboriginal education for Catholic Ed for 5 years, to become the inaugural Director of Education at IATSIS in Canberra. So today I want to share with you some thoughts based on my lived experience and research on why Aboriginal English really matters in research spaces, across education systems, especially with teaching degrees, and for the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. As you mob would know, since colonisation, many Indigenous peoples have been forced to speak standard Australian English at the expense of ancestral languages, Creole or Aboriginal English. With our ancestral languages stolen, and being the adaptive and highly intelligent people us blackfellas are, we took the way the colonisers talked and forced us to talk, and decolonised it to suit our needs. Today, over 80% of Aboriginal people across this continent, now known as Australia, speak Aboriginal English in some way. Aboriginal English, for those who don't know, differs from standard Australian English in many ways, including sentence formation with rules and sounds. Aboriginal English varieties often incorporate words from local Aboriginal languages. Some varieties of Aboriginal English include Broome lingo, spoken in northwest WA, Koori or Murray English, spoken in Queensland and across the East Coast, or Noongar English from around Perth Way. What makes Aboriginal English different from many ancestral languages and Creole in some ways is that Aboriginal English is not taught in a Western sense. Like Creole though, Aboriginal English is a community developed language with aspects of English which belongs to the communities that speak it, and it's a marker of Aboriginal identity. Aboriginal English is rich. Aboriginal English is diverse. Aboriginal English holds so much power and connection with the peoples that speak it, and it pains me that so many non-Aboriginal Australians, and some mob mind you, wave Aboriginal English away as broken English or rubbish talk, with potentially life-damaging consequences. Due to this, sharing the importance of Aboriginal English is something that I see as central to my studies, my work at ATSIS, and my life, if I'm honest, and as a key way to support the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, to understand my passion for sharing the value of Aboriginal English, I need you to understand some of my family story. And, as protocols necessitate, I begin by sharing where my mob are from and my connections to family and country. As I said earlier, I am from both Bardi and Gidja peoples of the Kimberley. I am Bardi and my bloodline comes from Judith of Pender Bay and through her son Lulu William Mungat. I am connected to Bardi country and community through the Angus, Albert and Dougal families, and my parents reside on Yulnul country as carers of place through connections recognised by Uncle Roy Wiggin, Auntie Esther Bevan, Auntie Margaret Clemens Smith and Auntie Dottie Cox. I also have matriarchal connections to Turkey Creek and Frog Hollow on Gidja country, where my granny Lily McCarthy was stolen from and sent to Beagle Bay Mission in the early 1900s. It was at the mission where Granny Lily and Lulu Willie met and fell in love. They had 10 children over the years, and one of them was my nan, Missides, or Nana Missy. As was the goal of pretty much all missions, the aim was to civilise and evangelise the Aboriginal population. And as such, ancestral languages and cultural practices were largely forbidden, while Christian cultures were espoused as a replacement. Aboriginal children, particularly girls and young women, were cultivated into a life of indentured servitude for white women and their families. And this was certainly the case for Nana Missy and her siblings. To ensure the hireability of my grandmother, her last name was changed from Mungat to Gregory, as Mungat was deemed too black, with Gregory being much more palatable. Now a bit about my mum. My mother's name is Petronella. Mum grew up in and around Derby and Broome, and when she was 15, Mum was made a ward of the state and sent 2,500 kilometres away from country for her education. Mum told me how she and other Aboriginal children from the north were punished for speaking Broome lingo or rubbish talk and pushed to speak standard Australian English. In our more recent yarns around this, Mum explained that due to negative experiences with speaking Aboriginal English to teachers and white students, and in work-related roles in white companies and government agencies, Mum realised that she, like many other Aboriginal people, still held internalised shame around speaking Aboriginal English. Now a bit about me. I grew up all over this continent, born in the late 70s on Wongatha land and raised across Noongar Budja, Yaru Buru, and both Wiradjuri and Warramai countries. I think back to our unsettledness and I wonder how much of it was because we were torn between Dad's family being situated on the East Coast and Mum's connection and longing for country back home in Broome. And it wasn't until I was much older that Mum told me how hard it was for her to be away from Broome, her family, and from country and community. Both Mum and Dad wanted me to get a good education, so, like my mother, I spent most of my school life being educated in the southwest of Western Australia. Mum no longer spoke Aboriginal English at home, and there were few Aboriginal English speakers at my school. And so, as a result, I would only be immersed in Aboriginal English when we went back to the Kimberley for funerals or holidays. I was schooled in white, mainstream education in the 90s and was engaged in an education with little or no regard for Aboriginal culture nor language, ancestral or otherwise, and I spoke standard Australian English. On one of our visits back home, I overheard comments that I didn't sound Aboriginal and that I spoke too white, which revealed to me a perceived disconnect that I didn't even know existed. I didn't realise it then, but later I would come to learn the connections between identity, language and culture, positionality and also racism, both internalised and inflicted. As a result of childhood experiences, education, language policies and practice, and the subsequent denial of my mother's mother tongue, I began to reflect upon a part of my identity that I thought was missing, namely a sense of belonging within myself and to my community that is linked to speaking Aboriginal English. I knew that this link was powerful, but I didn't realise how powerful it would be until I became a primary school teacher. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on in this talk. These familial and personal experiences illustrate that both explicit and implicit language bias against Aboriginal English continues to hold power and forces Aboriginal people to navigate linguistic imperialism daily. Negative attitudes towards Aboriginal English risk the lives and livelihoods of Aboriginal people every single day in this place. For example, many Aboriginal people have been left without Aboriginal English interpreters when dealing with police, health providers, and across education settings. The misinterpretation of Aboriginal English can lead to incarceration, misdiagnosis of health condition, and perceived language disorders, and even lead to low standardised education outcomes. And you know, what's most frustrating to me is that systems, including those that propose, plan, conduct and fund research, continue to ignore the important role that understanding Aboriginal English has across areas that impact the social determinants of health for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, such as education, employment, working conditions, housing access, early childhood development, access to quality, safe health services. Even the latest push for co-design and public policy. How can we co-design anything if home language of mob is not even acknowledged? By excluding Aboriginal English from reports, strategies and policies, the powers that be not only deny the legitimacy of our connection to community, culture and our identity, they continue to contribute to our ongoing oppression. But on a positive note, or on the flip side, speaking Aboriginal English leads to improved feelings of self-recognition and relaxation. It reinforces group identity, solidarity and cohesion. Using Aboriginal English maintains and asserts Aboriginal identity, and celebrating Aboriginal English, especially in schools, leads to better engagement and overall well-being for Aboriginal students, which in turn can lead to better educational outcomes. My personal experiences have also made it very clear to me the richness and the black joy that comes along with Aboriginal English. Aboriginal English acts as an expression of my identity as an Aboriginal person, as well as a way of strengthening my connections across different Aboriginal communities. It has been vital to my understanding of myself and where I fit in this world. The work of CoEDL, with its focus on exploring how language allows people to pursue complex ideas and develop unique perspectives of our world, has been instrumental in recognising the power languages hold to articulate culturally specific ways of experiencing and understanding the world. This perspective on languages is one that resonates with me, as Aboriginal English is intimately tied to how I engage with people, ideas, and my work at IATSIS. So, remember before when I talked about how it was when I became a teacher and I saw the power of Aboriginal English? Well, I'm going to spin you a little yarn about a time when I had a class of Year 3 students on my practicum back in Broome. In this particular class, there were only a few Aboriginal English-speaking kids, and they were often, I noticed, sent out during literacy lessons in the hallway to sit down with a standard Australian English-speaking parent helper to do their sight words while the rest of the class developed complex, rich narratives. This particular day, I had all the kids on the mat, with the Aboriginal English-speaking students feeling less than engaged. It was hot, it was the end of the day, and to be frank, I couldn't blame them. The classroom really didn't reflect them nor their cultures, never mind that school was on their country. There's a bit of wiggling and nattering was going on, so I decided to start talking about family. I said loudly, "Okay kids, who here has a gugs or a gugger?" Immediately, the 3 Aboriginal English-speaking kids sat up dead straight. So you see, gugs or gugger is the Aboriginal English word for uncle. 3 little black hands shot straight up into the air and they're like, me, pick me, miss. And the rest of the class were looking at them and at each other and then back to the boy saying, what? Who's that? What does that mean? And so I asked one of the young fellas to answer and he said proudly, that means uncle, I got lots of guggers. And so I said, oh, solid, you speak 2 languages. Okay then, who here has a titter? And by this stage, the Aboriginal English speaking kids were hooked. Hands straight up in the air, chest puffs out, me, pick me. You could hear the standard Australian English speaking kids asking each other, what's a titter? What's a titter? What's he saying? I asked another of the boys to explain and he said, well, that's my sister, but sometimes we say jidder too. I said, oh, Deadly, you speak 2 languages as well. Who else in the class here speaks 2 languages? None of the standard Australian English speaking students raised their hand, but those 3 boys did. High and proud, chest puffed out and their smiles wide. I got them to talk about their weekend fishing trip and they told the most complex, rich, hilarious narrative better than any of the other kids in that class. They were rock stars for the rest of the day. I was only a second year student teacher at that stage, but I remember wishing the teacher understood the value, the importance and the connection that Aboriginal English held for those particular Aboriginal children, their lives and their opportunities to succeed in an education system that is not and was not built for them. I can't help but wonder what the rest of their school life was like and how much better it could have been. And it's why I decided to dedicate my future studies and career to this space. Aboriginal English is so many things to so many mobs, and among these things is the ways in which Aboriginal English is also so damn funny. Against all odds, including the onslaught of invasion, dispossession and oppression since British invasion in 1788, we have maintained our sense of humour and connection to each other, a lot of the time through our use of Aboriginal English. Swears in Aboriginal English that mean one thing to us and other things to non-Indigenous people always get a laugh, and we can use those naughty Aboriginal English ways in some of the most formal settings and get away with it. And it is especially hilarious when you know that there are other mob in the room. Hearing little ones bust out with laughter when the teacher tells them that they're going to be studying science and they'll be looking at mini beasts in class, I'll let you Google that up yourself. Or when we hear non-Indigenous people mispronounce things, like at that nationally televised football match the other month when the commentator mentioned Buru Island instead of Bardu Island. Aboriginal English and humour connect mob with the biggest of belly laughs from Perth to Darwin, from Melbourne to the Torres Straits. These experiences illustrate the significance that humour and also how speaking Aboriginal English for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is central to who we are, and is also how it can be a protective factor when we're having to deal with ongoing daily oppression. Knowing the pride, the confidence and the black joy Aboriginal English brings, you can understand how devastating it is to witness this amazing connective and adaptive language being dismissed in classrooms, and the hurt and confusion it causes Aboriginal children who are told that how they are speaking and writing is wrong. If you tell an Aboriginal child that their home and community language is broken English, you are telling them that their culture and their identity are also broken. The value that the practice of Aboriginal English by Indigenous students brings to their own learning and to the education system more broadly needs to be celebrated. Their multilingualism and combined vocabulary of Aboriginal English and Standard Australian English is much larger than that of their non-Aboriginal peers. Code-switching between Aboriginal English and Standard Australian English can and should be actively promoted and scaffolded by teachers. This strategy will support Indigenous students in the understanding that they belong in mainstream schooling without having to sacrifice their home language and culture. Harnessing cultural and linguistic difference as a source of creativity and insight in our schools and wider society will not only benefit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, but all Australians. Encouragingly, my research on Aboriginal English has shown that a greater understanding of the linguistic and cultural specificity of Aboriginal English in pre-service teachers leads to more positive attitudes around its use by students in the classroom. This finding shows that changing attitudes and practices are possible when non-Indigenous people display a willingness to learn about Aboriginal English, including critically reflecting upon the complicity of non-Indigenous people and the structures in perpetuating ill-informed, damaging ideas about it. I'm excited to let you know that at IATSIS and with my education team and sidling up alongside our new languages group, hi Dr. Marmion if you're in the crowd, we will be embarking on a range of professional learning for teachers that will support the critical self-reflection needed to understand how to deliver education that embraces linguistic difference and improves pedagogical practices. I hope to have an Aboriginal English masterclass up and running in 2023, so watch this space. I have hope that through education, Aboriginal English will gain the respect it deserves as an authentic expression of Aboriginal identity and community. This work includes promoting Aboriginal English as a discrete language or dialect within the Australian education system, which can be leveraged to promote wellbeing and improved educational experiences and outcomes for Indigenous students, as well as used as an avenue for pursuing anti-racism in schools. I'm grateful for the many ways that CoEDL's vision of languages as dynamic, culturally situated frameworks for understanding the world and each other has contributed to this vision of Aboriginal English in both education settings and broader Australian society. I look forward to the day that Aboriginal English is a standing item on research agendas, informing government policy, improving education systems, and is known about and celebrated in every classroom across this country. It is certainly about time. Well, that's about it from me. I've got to get back to that beer or cuppa, depending on the time of day. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of this chance to celebrate the invaluable contributions that CoEDL has made to the language research space in Australia. Catch up.
Sharon, I'm very sorry that you're not here in person so that we can thank you in person. It was wonderful to hear such a deeply felt and clear and passionate and illuminating talk about something that's, I think, dear to all of our hearts, and it encapsulates what we've been trying to do here in CoEDL, and it sets the scene for these 3 days where I think that a lot of the themes and points you touched upon will come up again and again. So please join me one more time in thanking Sharon Davis for Okay, so I'm going to say some words to frame what we'll be doing over these 3 days. I'll just pass over that slide, but I certainly want to begin after the welcome to country that we received by acknowledging that we are on the lands of Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and to acknowledge their elders, past and present, that we are standing on unceded lands, and to convey my respects to all First Nations peoples of this land and others who may be present today. And thank you for your spiritual encouragement of what we do. And also just to say that in terms of what Cheyne was talking about, I hope that we're passing into this 3rd phase and doing our respectful part towards what's a really vital part of national healing and reconciliation. And that's something that's not just about Australia, but about many other parts of the world as well. So when we began CoEDL, which started its funded life in 2014, but already had begun the sort of brainstorming period in 2013, what we set out to do was to transform the science of language. And why did we feel that was so important? At that time, there was a dominant view in linguistics, especially associated with generativist approaches, that what we should study was an idealised speaker-hearer in a homogeneous speech environment. So there you can see a number of John Malkovich is there, speaking some form of universal language. And the view of language was that they were only superficially different. They were all sculpted by some sort of universal grammar. What we've wanted to do is to put diversity, variability and change at centre stage, as exemplified by a whole lot of our CoEDL researchers who you can see there. Of course, I would love it if it was even more diverse than it is, but that's the direction we want to move in. And we want to transform the science of language by moving the focus to three things especially. So diversity of languages, charting how different they can be, variability, seeing how a single speaker or a bunch of kids in a classroom, as we just heard from Sharon, can vary, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ways. The small ways can make a huge difference in terms of how you're categorised socially, but also across life stages. We all change through the course of our life, and across settings. We adapt how we speak to who we're with and what the setting is. And over time, those small changes can be amplified into large changes, and this is how we can understand the driving forces of language change, which include how languages branch out into language families, how languages co-evolve with culture, with demography, with society, to take forms that reflect the societies they're spoken in, but which also give us clues to the deep history of humankind. And they also serve to us as an illustration of how humans can evolve intricate and well-tuned structures without the need for any conscious planning. They're the best example of how humans can do this. So it's an immense challenge, and we were generously supported by the ARC, Australian Research Council, over 7 years, which stretched out into 8.25 years due to COVID and some other delays. In a way, despite all the difficulties of COVID, that was fortunate in giving us a little more time to pursue the things that we wanted to do. And it enabled us to bring together a huge team. So to begin with, our team of chief investigators changed a little bit over the 7 years, so this is the sort of maximal team. A couple of people stepped out and a couple more have stepped in at 4 Australian universities, here at the Australian National University, at Western Sydney University, at University of Melbourne, University of Queensland. I won't read out all the names. You know them, you can read them, and I'm sure by now most people in CoEDL know each other fairly well. Then we were very fortunate to have a large group of partner investigators and partner institutions from around the world, in Australia, from app and speech technology represented by Judith Bishop, who's here today, and we've also got a couple of other people from our international partners here today who I'd like to introduce, because we're so fortunate that they made the effort to come so far. So Raphael, Raphael, I'll get to in a second. That's Steve Levinson, who's here from the Max Planck Institute of Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen. And then IATSIS in Canberra was initially represented by Jackie Troy, who was then poached by University of Sydney, but we've had very strong connections with IATSIS, as mentioned by Sharon in their address and through Doug Marmy. And a whole lot of other scholars who are there on the screen, and in case any of you watch the recording of this when it's broadcast, I would like to thank you for all of your input, creative, intellectual, personal, over the years of CoEDL's operation. Over time, this grew into a far-flung network of collaborators from most parts of the world. You can see some of the names here, because again and again, people would hold workshops, would make connections, would get ideas about what to do, and this network has grown and grown over time. Another key part of what we have done and what has made us who we are as a community has been our advisory board. It's always vital in life to get good advice, and we set this up at the beginning, and we have had two chairs of the advisory board over its lifetime, both of whom are on this slide. Kate Burridge, who was our inaugural, she was here, sorry, my eyes are failing me. Kate, thank you so much for coming here. Tony, unfortunately, couldn't make it, who's the current chair. A number of other people who you can see up here on the screen. Clint Bracknell isn't here right at this moment, but he'll be here giving the public lecture tonight. Dan is here, up the back there. Thank you for coming across the Pacific, and thanks also to Rafael Nunez for coming across the Pacific, and to Anne-Marie Morgan, and just... yes, thank you, up the back. Thanks for coming across from Adelaide. And the other members of our board weren't able to come today, but I'd just like to thank them over the years for the many really useful things that they've talked to us about over the years, and in many cases even joined in on research projects. They didn't just stay at arm's length, but all sorts of things have developed out of those interactions. So, language takes many forms, and we wanted to, as we said, transform the language sciences, and we took from the beginning the view that language is too important just to be left to the linguists. There's a tendency to think of linguistics as the field that studies language, but in fact we need a lot more to understand it. We need anthropologists, we need philosophers, we need information scientists, we need speech therapists, and we brought in a whole range of people from different backgrounds, psychologists, to help us understand this. The design was premised on bringing people together in all sorts of recombinative ways. And I'll just pass through this briefly, using our logo as a way of organising what we look at. So the first one of what we call our programs was shape. There we're concerned with the question of what's out there. What can languages be like? What is what we can call the design space, the possibility space of languages? And in our region, as in other parts of the world, there's still a huge amount to discover. There's things that languages can do which no one thought possible, which the science of language just thought, no, languages don't do that. And we found it. All sorts of things that people hadn't even imagined have turned up. We'll hear about some of those through the 3 days. And to do this, it means often doing fieldwork on the spot in a speech community where the language is spoken, typically by a PhD, a postdoc, another researcher, drawing on the energies and enthusiasm of community members. Often those roles flow into one another, recording stories, building up a corpus that is a collection of everything in the language. We're very proud that 19 grammars were published by CoEDL members over our lifetime, and a grammar can take 10 years of your life, to produce. This is a really a major thing. And 12 dictionaries. And a dictionary can take 50 years of time by not just one person, but typically dozens of people. So when we see one little point in our list of what we've done, I just wanted to unpack those points because there's so much there. And the same, we've seen research carried out on 210 languages, still just a fraction of the world's 7,000 languages, and new documentation on 130 of them. These are really giant pushes because of how much is involved in each one of them. And then for each language, we need to know how it's learnt. According to the structure of the language, children face very different challenges. And we still know very little about how that happens. And then, of course, we can't just look at how one child learns language because different children learn it in different ways. So on the one hand, we've had studies of how children learn languages that hadn't really been looked at before and which are very different in the challenges they pose. So, for example, Murintata from the Daly River region, from Wade, is what's called a polysynthetic language with very long words. Surely that's difficult for children to learn, but work by Will Forshaw and Rachel Nordling and others found that even children who are 3 years, 7 months old, are producing really complicated words like this one, Damneriwakana. He keeps following us with all sorts of intricate morphology inside the verb. So it seems that what we thought was wrong, we thought that it was going to be very difficult for children to learn these morphologically complex languages, and that doesn't seem to be the case. And then we've had work carried out here in Canberra by Evan Kidd and his child language lab, looking at how individual children differ in their acquisition of language. Now, to study how a language is learned, it takes many years, not just 5 or 7 or 10. We're still all learning, and that's the sort of thing where some centre funded over 7 years, turning into a little bit more, allows us to do the research that we need to do to understand this. Because you can't change horses midstream. If you're tracing the evolution or the learning of one child's language, you've got to just keep tracking them. And you can't say 3 years in, and also we've run out of funding, or the research grants at an end. So that's been a tremendous advantage of the longitudinality of CoEDL, and that's one of the themes we'll be looking at tomorrow. There you hear young Nathan performing or speaking that were just among many others. Then when we learn a language, we have to use it or process it. And there's a question as to whether we process different languages differently. So languages in the highlands of Papua New Guinea are famous for the fact that people speak in paragraphs. They chain clauses together into incredibly long paragraphs. Does that mean that you have to use language differently because you're planning ahead so far? That's a question that was studied in the field by Hannah Savasi, who's a field linguist, and Alba Tuninetti, who's a classic sort of lab psycholinguist. And something else we were able to do in CoEDL was just to put people together in unexpected ways and say, well, here you are talking about coffee, let's do something, let's give it a go and carry out some more high-risk research, if you like, to see whether it's possible to adapt the sort of clean, nicely tidy structures of lab investigations to the field. For example, how do you take EEGs up into the field to measure people's brain potential as they speak? And then when we talk of change, when we talk of how language comes to be, we are talking about evolution on scales which reach back to the beginnings of our hominin or hominid ancestors, because we don't know whether it was just Homo sapiens who began to speak or whether our Neanderthal cousins and our Denisovan cousins and so on were already speaking, and exactly when. So that's a very long way back. And there it was very special to have philosophers like Kim Sterelny and his postdocs on our program, and they wrote some really important books. which one is this from signal to symbol, and then another of our partner investigator team, Morten Christensen, who with Nick Chater wrote this book on language evolution, which looks at how learning and processing load the dice about how languages can evolve. Then we can run right through time, through language families, which might be 5,000 or 10,000 years old, and hold clues to the deep history of the peoples of wherever we look in the world, down to very small scale things, changes that are going on around us and that we can observe. And the Sydney Speaks project, for example, that Catherine Travis, who's here today, also led to look at the changes that have occurred in Sydney English, both over 50 years by comparing back to earlier recordings and ongoing through the lifetime and in different communities, can give us vital clues about how language change occurs, and that all gets summed up over years, over decades, over centuries, over millennia. Now, to produce all of this, we need to make sure that our research is there forever, so that people can look back, so that people from the communities we work with can go in and maybe they want to listen to their grandparent speaking or someone else. Archiving is at the centre of this, and we're very proud that the Paradisic Archive in particular, led by Nick Teberger, and the great co-architect of that was Linda Barwick and Amanda Harris at the University of Sydney. This has gradually been accumulating material. It's now one of the great language archives of the world, with 1,334. I'm sure the number's gone up since I made this PowerPoint. It's a very large proportion of the world's 7,000 languages are in there, and this archive has been recognised again and again for the way it is so navigable, it's so well designed, and through the 8.25 years of CoEDL's lifetime, we've been able to build this up. We then have to work out how to keep it going to the next phases. But it's been, a tremendous solid achievement in just building the ground of what we need, something that's there for everyone, from researchers to community members to whoever else. We can't look at language without developing new technologies to do it. And this was also written into our program from the beginning. And Janet Wise led this part of our program. And the idea here is that all sorts of new technologies will be needed. We didn't know at the beginning of CoEDL what they would all be, because it's a very rapidly changing space. And through that second horizontal thread, our idea was that it will be the technologies that tie the programs together, because that's where we get talking about what do you need to do next. So one example was the development of this ELPIS project, because in an early workshop, when Janet and others said, well, what do you linguists find the biggest barrier is to your work? A whole lot of people, myself included, responded, well, we can never transcribe enough. We've got 60 million words of Greek in a corpus, and yet a good PhD student working very hard, technologically clever, archiving all of their material at the end of their PhD, maybe they've got 20,000 words in there. Because it's a slow job. To transcribe 1 hour of story might take 100 hours of transcription. So the idea was to use technology not to replace human agency, but to speed it up. And we'll hear more about that really vital part of our work later on. And then there are questions of digital equity, to use a term that I learned from Tutor Bishop, who's here today, and we'll be talking later in the week also, but also through the Florence project. So people facing communicative challenges, whether they're living with Alzheimer's or with some other reason, how can we develop things that ease that task for them, for their families, and that's also been something really vital. A team based at the University of Queensland, and we'll hear more about that also through these days. And then we wanted to have the freedom to adapt to new research needs, and here I'd especially like to thank the Australian Research Council, because it's an act of faith. When we wrote a research proposal at the beginning, which was, I think, 568 pages or something like that, it was detailed enough that they thought, yeah, these people know what they're going to do, but you have to have the unforeseen. And we had to build in ways of dealing with the unforeseen, and that included a number of schemes for more high-risk research by early career researchers especially. And just to give a couple of examples of these, we'll hear more about today, the DUIA phonological awareness app that was on display yesterday at another conference here, and we'll see today, Yaku Garirake, which allows speakers of DUIA to pair sounds to letters and develop literacy in their language. Then we had questions that we already mentioned, like what's happening in the brain when you speak in paragraphs, how do you bind that together? A whole lot more. These are just examples. We'll hear many more. There's one more aspect of our logo I'd like to draw attention to. This open weave, because we were very lucky at the beginning to have this designated set of chief investigators and partner investigators who then starts hiring postdocs and recruiting PhD students and all of that. But language is something that belongs to everyone, that's central in the lives of everyone. So we wanted ways of reaching out to the community in what we do. And there have been many ways that we've tried to do this. So one of them is that we wanted to improve the recognition of language teachers in Australia. So Australia is not a country that performs very well in language teaching, and there's heroes in the classroom who are pushing against the trends somewhat. We wanted to recognise them, and that's why we set up the Patti Dawes Award based on the first known cases of language teaching between an Indigenous language of Sydney and English of Patjagorang from Sydney, and then William Dawes, and that is something that is awarded every 2 years. Here are the winners of the last such award, and this is something we will now hand on to be continued after the lifetime of CoEDL. We've also had things like the Linguistic Roadshow, taking the excitement of studying language out to communities. We've had here down the bottom right-hand corner the early team, which deals with some of the issues that Sharon raised in their address. That is, how do we diagnose speech development in Aboriginal children growing up speaking Aboriginal English? Because the test items for that are based on standard English. So this early team has played a vital role in doing that. We'll hear more about that too. And through this, we wanted to build a growing community in many ways. Having summer schools, for example, has been part of it. Having summer scholars come on board over summer work, and many of those then went on to become researchers in CoEDL, having PhDs and masters and honour students and so on. And then just other people out there in communities, both in Australia and elsewhere, who just wanted to sign up and be involved in one way or another. So we wanted to work outwards, but we've also wanted to produce a structure where people will leave CoEDL come out at the end of CoEDL. That's the moment we're reaching now, as different people with different interests, broader interests and more interconnected interests than they brought into it at the beginning. And that is through all of the conversations and contacts and just researching together, talking together, tossing ideas around together that organisation like this enables. We wanted to favour new collaborations. And early on, this was in 2014, one of our brilliant PhD students, Lydia Byrne, who was working on visualisation, came up. I, in my ignorance, didn't know what a sociogram was or how you do it, and she said, well, why don't we do a sociogram showing who's worked with who in CoEDL. That, on the left, was the initial starting point for chief investigators and partner investigators. Well, some of us have worked together, really. On the right is a latest snapshot of all CoEDL investigators and who's worked with who. And I hope you can see from that very dramatically how that network has grown. We see it as like the brain growing together, the synapses coming together over time. I'd like to pause for a second. This is a celebration, but also a moment of sobriety when we remember those who are no longer with us. Jeff Ellman, who was a founding member of our advisory committee and became a dear friend to many of us and an inspiration. Kathy Bowe, who did a really fundamentally important PhD with us, looking at how to develop curricula for Bini Gunwok, and Anne Cutler, who was right there from the beginning, one of the great conceptualisers of what CoEDL could be, who was fearsome and fearless in her approach to everything, and oversaw something that I think we're all proud of in CoEDL, that is the Transdisciplinary Initiative Grants program, which is what underlay putting young researchers together to do daring, high-risk things. High risk can mean many things, but whoever chairs the panel that evaluates those has to have a nose for talent and a nose for bullshit, and had both, and brought those. So I think a lot of the success of that program was due to her possession of those two characteristics and many others. Yeah, my respect and a sense of loss for those three people. I was tempted to have another slide showing all the babies born in CoEDL, just to replace death with life. There have actually been so many I couldn't fit them all on one slide, but that's something we're also very proud of, because we wanted to create a space that was family-friendly and forward-looking, and we hope that despite all of the problems, especially problems during the COVID pandemic, that people are going forward with a sense of positivity about research and about the many ways the language sciences are opening up. So just to close with some words about the program, today we're focusing on all the ways that our studies of language reach out into society. So there you can look at your programs to see what will be there. I'm not going to spruik every little thing, but just come along to all of it, because there's so much happening there. And then we have our public lecture this evening with Clint Bracknell, who's on our advisory panel. I mentioned that our advisory panel have really pitched in, and this is one way in which Clint is pitching in for us. And then tomorrow's program has been designed by the original chief investigators and focusing on what we've discovered with respect to our original conceptions of what we wanted to do. And then we'll have a reception in the evening. And then on Friday we pass the mantle to the next generation of researchers. So we handed that on to our postdocs and PhDs to organise, and because we think that's how a centre should work. We want to give that excitement and that responsibility to the next generation, so you can get an idea for that on the Friday. So that's what the program is in its broad terms, and now it's time to let the feast begin in a particular form of a coffee break. But before we go to that, some housekeeping remarks from Romina. Thank you.